I am here with Waleed Shahid, who is a great progressive organizer. He has worked in the past on the Ocasio-Cortez campaign. I believe that's when we first met, and is currently the Justice Democrats Communications Director. Also wrote this great piece in the Nation about a blueprint for social movements during the Biden presidency, which we're going to discuss today. But how are you doing, Waleed, first of all?
Um, I'm shocked as everyone else at what's been happening, and so I'm just following the news as everyone else is, and it's pretty alarming.
Yeah, for everybody listening, you're going to be listening to this over the weekend, most likely. Right now, the terrorist attacks, presumably, are happening at the Capitol building, the storming of the Capitol, and also the bombs that are being found there. So, or the bomb, and then a bomb at the RNC as of recording this right now. So we're going to try to just pivot to the Biden campaign, because we also just found out that Jon Ossoff has officially won his race. So a lot of news this afternoon, but that means that the Democrats will have the tiebreaker when it comes to the Senate, and of course still hold on to a narrow majority in the House. And part of what you talked about in your piece is there were five prongs here. So the fight for the soul of Biden's policy agenda was one of them. That's the second one. The fight for the soul of Biden's administration and personnel, which was one of the prongs. I want to go through all of them. The fight for the soul of the congressional Democrats, the fight for the soul of our multiracial democracy, and then also the fight over public sentiments. Those are the five fights that you laid out, that are the ones that progressive Democrats are going to need to focus on when we're trying to pressure the Biden administration. So can you just give me an
hmm
overall view of your piece here, and then we can talk about the implications of the Senate and the House, the Senate now being Kamala Harris being the tiebreaker, how that can change and help in moving forward a progressive policy agenda under the Biden administration.
Yeah, so I started my piece by just referring to how Joe Biden campaigned on a fight to restore the soul of America. And I think, in that frame, it's unclear what the soul of the Biden presidency is going to be. And so there are all these places where we are going to have to battle it out and see where we land on the other side. But last night's or this morning's victories of Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock are major victories for Democrats and also progressives who want to see legislation actually enacted and passed on all of our agenda items. And so, yeah, I started off with just a lot of the conversation, at least in the last 2 months, has been about the Biden cabinet, the Biden personnel, where there have been significant victories that have been won, and also places like just today where Merrick Garland was appointed as Attorney General, which who is much more, very much to the right of the Democratic Party consensus on criminal justice reform. And so on each of these different places, we have some leverage, some ability to push, some places more than others. And it's important that we start to think about these different places where we can be pushing.
Yeah, so I kind of listed through all of the prongs of your piece, the different fights that we need to do. So we'll start with the administration, because a lot of that has been largely filled out. And you cite Ron Klain as the appointment for chief of staff as one of the wins for progressives when it comes to Joe Biden. Bruce Reed was discussed for many different positions, including the Office of Management and Budget, which ended up going to Neera Tanden, who, despite being combative with people online, I've been blocked for a few years now, isn't a austerity hawk in the way that Bruce Reed is. So I would say it's a net positive, the Biden appointments from the progressive perspective, based on what we know of his ideology and what his past has been. Would you agree with that assessment?
I think it's a mixed bag. I mean, so for, the appointment of Deb Haaland was a significant achievement by progressives. With Javier Becerra, that's a strong progressive achievement at HHS. Big gains within the economic policy team with Jared Bernstein, Heather Bushi, Bharat Ramamurthy, Joel Gamble. These are all progressives, largely associated with organizations like the Economic Policy Institute, also with people who at one point or another worked alongside Elizabeth Warren. And these are strong progressive appointments, and we should applaud them. John Kerry getting a special appointment to being climate envoy, Ali Zaidi getting to be the domestic equivalent of that position. It signifies that the progressive movement has been able to make, through the Green New Deal, climate change a major priority within the Biden administration. And so we should be, those are good picks. And it shows that it's going to be a priority in a way that it was not for President Obama. That said, Bruce Reed was appointed Deputy Chief of Staff. Like I said earlier, Merrick Garland was appointed to Attorney General. There are several appointments that are not progressive. I would say this administration is not as progressive as the Congressional Democratic Party as a whole, where about half the party in Congress is in the a little less than half of the party in Congress is made up of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. So
well, that's a big tent. Yeah. I mean, I know that there's been a bit of an effort to kind of make membership of the Progressive Caucus a little bit more stringent, I guess, because there's a lot of people involved there. But I totally agree with you that I'm just saying it's more of in the way that Obama's administration was kind of packed with whoever Citigroup listed. It's not as direct and has more progressive influence and more care taken to cater to progressives than I think Obama even did, because he was riding off of this big win where there was less expected of him. So I totally agree with your assessment. So now the fight for the soul of Biden's policy agenda. That's when we bring it back to Jon Ossoff's win here. So now we have a 50-50 split with Kamala Harris as the tiebreaker. Presumably, if something crazy doesn't happen, I think right now there is still potential for Purdue to request it might be within 0.5 points, so he could request a recount. But climate is obviously an issue that's near and dear to your heart, and you talked about John Kerry as the climate czar. Based on reconciliation being such a huge part of what's going to have to happen in the Senate and Biden's agenda, outside of combating COVID and potentially these new stimulus checks as well, which would be great, what do you see Biden being able to do in the Senate now that there's a 50-50 split in terms of his agenda on climate and then some of the other issues that you talked about in your piece?
Yeah, so you're right that, on day one, they should cut those checks out. That are the main reason why, a big reason why Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff won their elections. They should just get that done and say they delivered for the American people. And then as they move into the other pieces of their legislation, the immediate roadblock that Democrats are going to face is obviously the filibuster and these issues of structural reform in our democracy. And that is really going to take a major fight from Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer against conservative Democrats in their party like Kyrsten Sinema, Joe Manchin, even Chris Coons, who is still waffling on the filibuster despite being a major Biden ally. And so I do think the filibuster will dominate a lot of our conversation going into late January, early February. Progressives have a lot of leverage with Chuck Schumer, who is looking over his shoulder about 2022.
Yes.
In the room where Biden, Schumer, and Pelosi meet, Schumer has to go home and explain to one of the most progressive primary electorates in the country why he's working with Susan Collins on legislation instead of Democrats. And so I think there is some leverage there, but it's going to be a huge fight to make sure that happens. And then on the actual agenda, I think progressives are really need to push for that stimulus package, economic recovery package to be as bold, as big as possible. They should include the 16 million jobs that will be created for clean energy infrastructure in that package, in large part because even some of the biggest things Obama did on climate change were in his initial 2009 recovery package. So there's no excuse for Joe Biden not to include some aspects of the Green New Deal in that package. He can include an expansion of Medicare. Pramila Jayapal yesterday called for expanding Medicare for people over 50, for people under 25, and the unemployed. He can include that in his stimulus package. And then there's a bunch of other things that on childcare, on some of the ways that environmental racism could be confronted through the stimulus package. That is his one shot. And the most important thing is that they have 9 months before the midterms start. And so they should not waste time. Basically, I don't know if I can cuss on this show, but they should not make time messing around with Susan Collins or Joe Manchin for two or 3 months, where they're doing these painful meetings in the White House where they're trying to get them to sign up for something. They should really start governing as soon as possible. And we've waited 10 years since unified control. Don't squander this opportunity.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And the thing about reconciliation, what defines what can be discussed for purely fiscal budgetary reasons is quite broad. So that's a positive, but it's also a negative because it can allow someone like Susan Collins or conservative people like Joe Manchin in the party to kind of dictate what gets through and what doesn't. But that makes the progressive pressure so much more important, because Biden, we've talked about this on the show, I wouldn't say that he's ideologically, he's not Joe Lieberman, or he's not Rahm Emanuel or somebody like that. He likes to, as Sam likes to say, place himself at the center of where the Democratic Party is, or at the heartbeat of the most safe position of the Democratic Party. And if progressives push that Overton window, that's key. And so I totally agree with what you're saying. And that brings us to, one, you did mention environmental racism there. So let's bring it to your fourth prong, and then we'll discuss your final one, the fight for the soul of our multiracial democracy. Biden has been proactive in putting people of color and women and people of all different stripes in his team, which I think is a positive. Even if it's, he would be appointing people who were within his ideology no matter what. So representation is important in that case. But I think you're talking about it in your piece on a more substantive level about judges and other positions that aren't as visible. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, we have a country that does not represent the multiracial majority of the country in terms of government, in terms of elections. And so whether that's and a lot of what we're seeing unfold in the Capitol today is a result of our political institutions not being able to, solve this issue of who our democracy represents. And so I am very, one of the most fundamental questions in our democracy today is, will Republicans continue to enshrine minority rule through not just illegal means, but legal ones, through what they end up doing with gerrymandering, with what they do with voting rights, with how they continue to be able to enshrine, disproportionately, like that 25% of our states in the country can essentially block any piece of legislation going through, and then through judges and through the Supreme Court. And so there are political solutions to all these things that are on the table. Ro Khanna has an act called the Fair Representation Act that would expand the House of Representatives and create multi-member districts that I think would really reduce political polarization in our country, would essentially create a system where Mitt Romney could have his own political party and Donald Trump could have their own political party. And it would end the issue of gerrymandering. Obviously, D.C. and Puerto Rican statehood needs to be on the agenda for addressing the imbalance of the U.S. Senate. And then the Supreme Court. We had a lot of conversations about expanding the Supreme Court this past year. And all those things need to continue to be on the agenda if we want to actually solve these crises that young people will end up inheriting if we don't solve now. These things are not going to go away with Donald Trump. They're baked into our system. So those were kinds of, I didn't get a chance to go fully into it, the details of it, but those were the kinds of the things that I was talking about.
Yeah. No, I completely, I feel like I'm a broken record. I agree with everything you're saying. Because obviously those things are key. And those are the kinds of fights that Republicans never shy away from in order to cement their influence and their power. They're militant about it. And I think obviously Democrats need to be the same way. So finally, you talk about the fight over public sentiment. The traditional Democratic way has been to be siloed away from activists and almost be repellent of them, right? Where activists are pushing the conversation forward, and some Democrats are scared and they don't want to seem like they're extreme. This has been par for the course since the Reagan era. A lot of establishment Democrats represent that philosophy. But embracing social movements, you talk about that. that's key for Biden as well, because you can push the conversation forward when you're in power. And it's something he has to understand. Can you talk a little bit more about what you talked about in regards to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's this famous quote from FDR to A. Philip Randolph, where A. Philip Randolph is a civil rights and labor leader from 1930s, 1940s, organized the March on Washington in the 1960s. He's pressuring FDR on these civil rights and labor rights provisions, and FDR says, "I agree with you, now make me do it." And that's why FDR was different than both President Obama and President Biden, because he understood how activists, how social movements could put pressure on the whole system to make it easier for party leadership to govern. And so we saw a lot of this in the Obama era with the Dreamers, Occupy Wall Street, the fight to end the Keystone Pipeline, the fight to stop the TPP, Black Lives Matter. There tend to be these large social movements that are not just resistance movements, but are actually putting things on the agenda and that are positive and transformational, that I think we are probably going to see a reemergence of under the Joe Biden administration. And I think someone like Ed Markey says, one of the reasons why his climate bill, the main Democratic Party climate bill in 2009, 2010, one of the reasons it failed was because there was no movement for Waxman Markey on the streets.
Right.
And so one of the reasons he says he sponsors the Green New Deal, he says, even if we can't get the full Green New Deal, at least there's going to be something out there that will push the entire political window to, help politicians in Washington enter the Overton door once the Overton window has shifted. Yeah. And so that's kind of what I was talking about there, is that there is a lot of room to push Biden, not just on the inside, but also on the outside.
Completely agree. Waleed Shahid of Justice Democrats, great organizer, and your piece in The Nation is excellent. A blueprint for social movements during the Biden presidency. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks for having me.